Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where leaders discuss what's coming next in satellites and space.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator today. Our guest today is Doug Loverro, independent consultant at Loverro Consulting, LLC. Doug, how are you?
Doing great, John. How are you today?
Well, I did my research on you and got all kinds of bachelor's degrees and master's degrees, experience here and high levels in the federal government. Just give us maybe a 30-second overview of your background before we get in this interview.
Sure. No, thanks, John. First, let me say it's great to be here, and I really do appreciate being invited in. You know, my background has been in all sides of the space business for at least the last 30 years. I had the privilege of managing the GPS program for the United States of America. I've managed many national intelligence programs. I was in charge of policy at the Pentagon. But more than that, I've gotten to meet a whole bunch of my partners in industry, a whole bunch of young folks who are interested in space, and to really work within this whole national infrastructure and the international infrastructure on how space affects life on Earth.
If you're listening to this, you can go to YouTube and type in your name, and there's some really good videos on. There's a 1-hour video you was talking to a group, and it was very interactive, and I learned a whole lot from it. And the key word that I think about is policy, and your interest in policy. So from your perspective, a pretty wide background here, what are the most important issues in space policy?
You know, we have been operating in space as a nation, as a world, for well over 50 years. And the interesting thing is, during most of that time, space was really mostly unregulated and mostly inhabited by two main competitors, the Soviet Union and the United States. So we never had the need to develop a policy for how others might operate. As long as the two superpowers kept out of each other's way, all was good. And so now we have, of course, 67 nations, many private companies operating in space for both national security, civil, and commercial benefit. We need ways to guide that interaction because it's a shared commons, and we have no rules to govern how we operate in that shared commons.
I keep thinking of a parking lot. So years ago, there were 2 cars in the parking lot. Now, all of a sudden, you can't find a space, and you're bumping into people going back and forth. Issues today that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago.
That's right. No, you're exactly right. I mean, in fact, the parking lot's a great analogy. There are any parking lot you go in today, there's lines in that parking lot. It tells you which way to park. I don't believe that Henry Ford had that problem. He could park anywhere he wanted to and face any direction he wanted to when he drove into that parking lot. But today, if you didn't have that order, you wouldn't be able to find a place to park. It's not that you are trying to get in somebody else's way or you're trying to tell somebody else where to do it, but that order allows us then to do what we really want to do, which is to turn space into a vibrant economic reality for the nation.
Some of the newer cars out there, when you back up, you get to see a little TV camera, you see what's behind you, so you are aware of what's going on around you,
Right.
And so this has applications in the world of space as well. Back in the day, there was 2 satellites out there, Telstar and who knows what, but today you have to be aware of what's around you in space, don't you?
That's absolutely correct. It's not that space is actually physically crowded, but when things do go bump in the night in space, the results of that bump stay around for eons, and so it's you need to be very careful.
I guess the term is space situational awareness. Is that the term that's used in the industry here?
Right. It's a great term that we've coined to mean knowing where things are and where they're going.
Now, that'd be different from traffic management, like I alluded to earlier. So 2 different concepts.
Traffic management is, I guess, would be called a superset of space situational awareness. So space situational awareness is just that. It's monitoring. It's understanding where things are, where they're going, nominally where they came from. Space traffic management is to then try to go ahead and direct that, and to try to go ahead and guide that activity to prevent accidents and to make it a safe place for economic activity to occur.
You talked about commercial space and defense space needs. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, in addition to the Soviet Union, you'll have organizations out there that have nothing to do with the United States or the Soviet Union, huh?
That's correct. As I said, there are 67 actors in space right now, more are being added every day. Most of them signatory to the 50-year-old space treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. And those folks they operate on their own with very little coordination. The most coordination we have is in the radio frequency realm to make sure that we don't step on somebody else's broadcast. But even that only accounts for a small subset of the kind of interactions that these satellites might have. So
we talk about different players out there in space. We talked about space situational awareness. The nitty-gritty from a professional's perspective, maybe some from the Pentagon, does that mean something different from a commercial organization?
Not really. We may do it for different reasons. We have air traffic controllers in the DoD. We have air traffic controllers in the civil society. They're both doing fundamentally the same thing, tracking objects in the air, figuring out where they're going, whether or not there's a hazard to their flight plan, and those kind of things. Same thing in space. The only difference is the defense air traffic controllers are doing it either so they can direct their own traffic home or shoot the other guy down. And the civil guys are just trying to make sure everybody can fly through it safely.
My next-door neighbor, Wayne, he works for the FAA. He's done it for many years. He puts on workshops, 8-hour workshop on how to delay. How to delay someone from landing. I imagine some concepts can be applied to space as well, huh?
It is, except, space is, we're governed by different physics in space. So air traffic is governed by Bernoulli, we like to say, and that gives us the ability to maneuver at will and in a rapid fashion. So you could easily see a flight controller saying, "Hey, satellite 2 or aircraft 259, please go ahead and maneuver and take heading 152 to avoid collision with traffic at 500 feet." Right? That's a typical kind of a statement. Such a statement would be meaningless for an orbiting satellite because, in general, orbiting satellites are dictated. Their paths is dictated by Kepler, who happens to operate without regard to where you might want to go. It's going to be where gravity takes you. Now there is maneuverability, but it's not like Luke Skywalker. It's not an X-wing fighter that'll go ahead and bank and turn. It's a very slow, deliberate process, and it takes many hours to go ahead and establish a maneuver and to execute a maneuver.
Expect a guy with a master's degree in physics would talk about Bernoulli, the Bernoulli box, and Kepler. Johannes, we call him around my house. Let's bring this down more to common level. When I've done my research on SSA, it seems like there's traditional ways to do it, maybe with looking through a telescope or the old-fashioned radar. There's other ways to do it now, aren't there?
Yeah, there's many ways to do SSA. Space situation awareness doesn't mean just looking at something or just sending a radar return. For example, one of the things that is done, and in fact is done by Kratos, is they detect and track where satellites are by their emissions, by their communication emissions, by their RF emissions. You can tell where something is. You simply measure the time that a signal arrives, know when the signal was sent, and by comparing the two, you can know how far the satellite is away. In fact, we all do this every day with our GPS receivers. That's all a GPS receiver is a fancy little receiver that measures when a signal left the satellite and when it arrived at your receiver, and by doing so, you can triangulate your position with respect to the satellite.
Earlier, we made this silly analogy with a parking lot and traffic and a lot of cars. So if the cars themselves can be congested, then the more cars, the more RF signals will be congested as well. So there'll be congestion with that RF signal, I would imagine.
Absolutely. In fact, RF, the reason I mentioned this, RF regulation is the one area where we do have international agreements, is because the congestion in the RF is the first level of congestion that you see. Two satellites might be over the United States. Both of them want to transmit a radio signal or television signal to users. We have to make sure that one of those signals doesn't block out the other signal. So there are registrations, conventions that are international, from the island of Tonga to the United States of America and everywhere in between. People have registered their rights to broadcast a certain frequency from a certain spot in the geosynchronous belt.
So that is determined by lottery, or is that an international group? Who determines that?
It's an international group. It's the International Telecommunications Union. Actually, it was the first international body started in these kind of pursuits back in, I think, 1847, if I'm not mistaken. We weren't flying in space in 1847, but we did have our RF emissions then. They were called telegraph, so it was actually the International Telegraph Union way back then, and then it became the International Telecommunications Union, and they were just coordinating to make sure that if your Morse code was going through, it didn't step on somebody else's Morse code. We didn't want people intercepting or jamming the signal from a ship in the middle of the Atlantic trying to go ahead and be rescued. So we had to go ahead and figure out a way to coordinate that traffic.
Imagine back then Jules Verne was thinking about going to the moon, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah, he was writing about it as well.
Absolutely.
So we have slots, I guess, for our frequency. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct. Some people don't understand how these slots work. They think they're physical slots in space. They're locations from where you can go ahead and generate certain RF energy. So a person may think, well, you can't come within so many degrees or so many miles or so many, if I use the Han Solo measurement, parsecs of my slot. No, you can't come into my RF basket. But if you're in a different frequency, you could be, in theory, we don't do this in practice, but in theory, you could be 10 feet away, as long as you're not transmitting at the same RF. Now, we wouldn't do that because the risk of collision is too high, but that's not really regulated. And in fact, today, the United States and other nations go ahead and reserve the right to get as close as they want to other satellites, as long as they don't step on their frequencies. That's something that's allowed to be done.
So is the current way the global community manages these satellites, is this done well? Is there opportunity for growth, or are you satisfied with the way it's doing now?
Well, from an RF interference basis, I think it's done well. The system has served us well. We have a thriving satellite telecommunications industry. Anybody in the industry will tell you it's not fast enough. Of course, nothing that's ever regulated is fast enough for industry, and I understand that, but there is a lot of coordination to be done. Certainly it could be done better. The problem is that only is one aspect of how things can happen in space. We don't have anybody who's actually doing the same kind of interference monitoring for physical space in space. And that's sort of redundant, but physical occupation of space. So, for example, as many of your listeners, I'm sure, know, we have several companies who are proposing to put up 1,000 satellite constellations in low-altitude orbit. Now, it's unlikely that they all will decide to put them up in that same 10-kilometer thick shell 1,100 kilometers from the Earth, right?
No parking spaces.
But there's nothing that says they can't, and there's nobody to tell them where to go. If I could take your analogy of the parking lot just a little bit further, John, there's a really interesting video that I would ask your listeners, if they're interested, they should look up. It's called 1904 Traffic in San Francisco. Okay, and it's a hilarious view of how automobiles, pedestrians, and horses interact on the streets of San Francisco. And it's it's literally a 15-minute movie of going down the streets and seeing people jump out of the way of horses.
I think I've seen that.
It's a fantastic thing. And it's what space is like today. Now, it's not as crowded as that. Let's be clear. But it was completely unregulated. Nobody had rules for who had precedence. How did you get out of other people's way? Did you have turn signals? There were no rules to regulate traffic. And quite frankly, if you're only moving at 5 miles an hour, not such a big thing. But when you're moving at 65 miles an hour, 70 miles an hour, you better have some rules. You're going to have a lot of collisions. Same thing's true in space. When you only have a few countries in there with a few objects, all that are really run by their governments, you don't really need a lot of rules to do this. But when you've got a panoply of users and participants there who are sending up thousands of satellites, some rules are it's not for the government's benefit. It's for those players' benefits. It's for all of those people's benefit, so they don't need to worry about collision. And the problem with collisions in space is they affect everybody. In fact, I used this analogy in a congressional hearing that I was in several months ago. The reason we started the FAA, for those of you who are interested in it, was really based upon a collision that happened over the Grand Canyon. I can't remember the exact date, but it was in the early 1950s. And two planes collided, and a lot of people were killed, and so the U.S. government changed a fairly low-level organization called the Commercial Aviation Administration into the Federal Aviation Administration, who was then given the authority to regulate air traffic because we had citizens killed. But the fact of the matter is as bad as it was that those citizens were killed, all the pieces of that debris fell to the ground, and they didn't interfere with anybody else's use of the air. If a collision in space happens, they stay up there, as I already said, for hundreds of years, eons or more, and they will interfere with everybody else's use of space. And so you really need somebody to go ahead and guide that before we clutter up this very important and very fragile system.
You brought up the year 1904, and I just finished McCullough's book on the Wright brothers, and they talked about the Wright brothers. There's just planes going everywhere. I mean, not many out there. And what happened, that transformed, and it went from a defense application to a commercial application, some regulation. I see parallels with the space. In fact, you talk about it. Space started off as defense application, now commercial and more regulation. Same thing with the internet, defense and regulation. And so this gets me concerned when there's multiple satellites out there. So let's go back to RF data. And so RF data actually has a role in controlling some of these crazy 1,000 satellites out there, huh?
I have an old friend. He'd like to say that there's only two things that keep satellites in orbit: gravity and RF emissions. An object that cannot communicate with the Earth is just as much as well be a dead rock, or maybe a Tesla Roadster, because at this point it's completely unguided, and there's no way to go ahead and tell it to go left or right or to do something that you'd want it to do. So the ability to communicate to satellites is the only method of going ahead and extracting economic or security or civil benefit from it. And so the importance of not interfering with that RF link is critical.
One of my heroes up on Capitol Hill, believe it or not, is Chairman Will Hurd. Really smart guy, likable guy, and I got an email from this morning. He has a set of hearings talking about artificial intelligence. And so I think about 1,000 satellites and some constellation, all these RF signals bouncing off here, bouncing off there, a little bit of regulations. I mean, this is at the point where there's going to be so much information out there, you may have to use artificial intelligence to make sense of all these RF signals.
Very, very, very possible. I don't think that we really know what it's going to look like 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. 1,000 years is probably too far for anybody to think about, but 100 years is certainly within our reckoning. If we go into this environment without those kind of rules of the road, then the likelihood that we'll find this to be beneficial to all of us is low. If we can come up with some right-minded rules of the road, I think that we'll all benefit from that. Regulation tends to sometimes take on a dirty word. People think of regulation as inhibiting economic success. I disagree. In fact, I think regulation is what leads to economic success. Truly well-regulated industries tend to go ahead and be able to exercise their economic destiny far better than an unregulated industry. An unregulated industry doesn't know the rules. So, for example, we have an unregulated industry right now, which is mining of the seabeds. There's a lot of materials under the seabeds, but there's no regulation governing who owns it and how you extract it and what the rules are. So no companies are willing to invest in it because the rules don't exist, and they're not going to go ahead and invest in it if the rules don't exist. They want that. They want those rules to be there.
It's almost like 1904, gold rush in California, and there was anyone could take whatever they wanted, and someone tried to say, no, this is a parcel of land that belongs to Doug Loverro and doesn't belong to Claude. So they wanted that, didn't they?
Well, in fact, I think that's a perfect analogy. The one I would use is the Homestead Act, right? The West wasn't born when the Homestead Act was signed. The West and all that land had been there previously. But who's going to go out west with unknown rights of whatever I settle on, right? So the Homestead Act said, if you go out there and you fence off, and I don't remember the Homestead Act, but we all learned it in 6th grade. If you fence off 10 acres and you farm it and you make it economically viable, it's yours. Well, suddenly that simple regulation, that simple law, created a land rush for the West. That land had been there previously, but it wasn't in the economic benefit of people to go there because they didn't know if the next day some cattle rancher would go ahead and run cattle all over his crops because there was no protection. So those kind of things allow economic success.
You walk out the door here, you pick up the newspaper, Elon Musk puts a car in space. And all of a sudden, Doug Loverro puts, who knows what, a bicycle in space. And everyone's going everywhere. This does not bode well for the future, it's understanding what's up there and why it's up there. And as entertaining as it is, though.
It is very entertaining. And I will tell you, I more, as much as anybody else, was entertained by Elon's fantastic success. And we should not go ahead and undersell that success that he had. The great thing about space is it's not easy to get to yet. I'm sure in another 50 years it will be more in reach of many people, but it's not easy to get to yet. So the people who get there with a certain amount of respect and a certain recognition that they have responsibility. But literally, I think it's less than a century away. Within the next half century, we will be seeing many private concerns sending small rockets to space on a routine basis, and they may not have the respect of somebody like Mr. Musk, who invested billions of his own dollars. He's not going to put that money at risk by polluting the environment, nor other nations. But when you don't have to pay for that, when you only have to pay $100,000 to go ahead and get your widget into orbit, you may not have the same respect as somebody who had to work to get there. And that's a poor... The word respect is poor because it makes it seem like somebody else doesn't care. But you probably aren't going to take as much care if you didn't have to put in as much effort.
Well, here we are in Washington, D.C. I'd be remiss if I didn't throw out an acronym. I'm part of the job here. I want to talk about the National Space Defense Center. And you think about all these things in space, cars, little red roadsters and whatnot out there. And there seems to be a lot of stuff out there. It looks like the National Space Defense Center has started running around the clock here. Now, is that because of the cars in space, or is that because of what?
The National Space Defense Center, which was previously called the Joint Interagency Combined Space Operations Center, so you can tell why we changed the name. It's focused more on the problem of defending things in space. In fact, it's right in the word defense. Originally, the function that we think about in terms of space traffic management was really done by the Joint Space Operations Center, the so-called JSPOC, at Vandenberg. But the JSPOC was focused really on that space situational awareness and monitoring things in space and not actively defending U.S. needs and U.S. assets in space. The National Space Defense Center, on the other hand, recognizes that while most folks who are going to space these days are going there with altruistic and economic reasons, some are going there for national security reasons, who may have views opposing the United States of America. And so that is a center to go ahead and deal with that problem of people who might be actively trying to go ahead and deny your use of space, rather than simply track the stuff that is up there that is not well regulated right now.
My dad taught me to drive defensively. Expect the next person out and keep your eye out all the time. And in the situation space now, you don't have to, I guess, orbit defensively, but you have to be aware of there could be, let's use the word, an adversary out there that may have ill intent. How's that for discreetly phrasing things?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's be clear. The United States and the Soviet Union back in the 60s, and every nation since then has primarily focused on space, first from a national security perspective, then from a civil space perspective, and lastly from an economic perspective. And that hierarchy of needs, if you will, existed from the very beginning. The hierarchy of economic needs is now starting to come higher, but that doesn't mean that the national security needs aren't still there. Our soldiers, U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen, our allies, really couldn't operate without space today, and that makes space a target, because if I'm using GPS to guide a bomb to your city, then you probably don't like GPS, and you'd like to find a way to deny that access to me. That's a natural thing. I have no preconceived notion that that's not a valid thing for a nation to do. We need to be wise enough to recognize they will do it.
When I was up on Capitol Hill talking to Chairman Hurd, he wanted a national cyber corps where someone would go to high school and learn cybersecurity. Maybe someone from your perspective may look at something like a space warrior corps. A lot cooler, wouldn't it? You get more recruits, I'd think.
Well, I actually know there's going to be one, because I saw these historical tapes. They were called Star Trek. And
the historical records.
Exactly. In every domain we've gone into ever, we have eventually gone ahead and created a professional military corps who understands that domain, so we can protect it for the benefit of the nation and for the world. I expect that will probably be the case for space. Whether or not we need to create a space corps or just a subunit within the Air Force, or if you believe Star Trek, the Navy, that is space specialists, that's to be determined. But I think it's absolutely unambiguous that at some point we will have a professional corps of military people who are focused on space.
So, looking down the road, get your little crystal ball out 5-8 years down the road. Where do you see this whole idea of space situational awareness playing out, and our frequency, and how's this for a phrase? Adversarial relationships. Sounds like divorce court.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you. First of all, I think I think the opportunity for many players to enter into this area is just fantastic. There are commercial SSA companies springing up left and right to meet the need that is going to exist to go ahead and figure out how this traffic exists in space. And it can't just be radar, and it can't just be visual. It's got to go ahead and be signals related. It's got to be related to new capabilities we may ask satellites to put on. For example, we may ask them to give us aids to tracking, just like an aircraft has a transponder on it that beeps its location so that it's easy to track. We may ask satellites to go ahead and do that so we can get better tracks on them. But I think the future is incredible. I think we are going to see these 1,000 satellites constellations. Back in the 1990s, there was a vision that maybe we'd have something called teledesic. It would have 1,000 satellites. I don't think any of us believed that it would really happen. But as I look at it today, it is absolute certainty there will be constellations of satellites that number in the thousands. There will be all sorts of economic activity, up to and including, probably not within 5 or 10 years, but in 20 years, mining in space. I was down at Jamestown just this past weekend, and I remember and we were talking about the first explorers who came over to the New World looking for success, and their economic dreams were failing constantly until they found tobacco. They didn't know they were going to find tobacco. They just came here for some economic success. People are going to figure out a way to exploit space for economic reasons, and that is going to go ahead and attract an entire new generation of people into space, and I think it's wonderful. So I'm looking forward to it.
You know, what amazed me in Jamestown is the size of those boats. They were so small, and you think about the aircraft out there. So that's really the start of the country. Those little teeny tiny postage stamp boats.
Exactly right. It's incredible. They had no idea what they were doing back then. They had no idea that what is now only 400 years later, what would come out of those 3 small boats.
Back to the future for us, huh?
It's an exciting time.
Well, Doug, unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Doug Loverro, independent consultant at Loverro Consulting, LLC. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much, John. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.